Welcome back to the Microsoft Partner Network Thought Leader Podcast series. In part 2 of this 2-part interview, we continue our talk with Tim Hurson about applying structure to our thinking in order to solve problems better. Tim explains that, by far, the largest processing part of the brain is the subconscious. Relying on only the logical or conscious part of the brain is akin to counting on fingers versus using a calculator.
So here's a question for you. So let's say I'm going to follow this procedure of make lists, make choices. At what point do I feel like I have completed step 1 and I'm now ready to move to step 2? Because I think one of the problems I have as a person is I tend to make that list, get to something that's really interesting, jump off the list to go focus on that thing. So how do I know that I've done the rigor, stayed with it?
So answering that question is kind of like predicting the future. So I don't know if I should get into predicting the future. But there's certainly, again, are once again, principles that you can use to help. You can set a numerical target. You can simply say, for this particular project, I'm planning a vacation. I'm going to write down 15 possible choices. And that's going to be better than what we started with, which was, I wonder where I'm going to go for vacation. Right? So even if it's not necessarily the super optimum best, it's going to be substantially better than where you started. The second thing that one can do is to take a break. One of the things that we know is, and we know this from cognitive science and neuroscience, is that it is really, really hard, that the process of making decisions is very different from the process of generating options. This is a different process. And it may be a very good idea to separate those two. So you might say to yourself, let's spend the next 15 minutes generating some lists. And then tomorrow, let's look at the lists again. And when you do that, several things will happen. One is you will be stimulated by the list to come up possibly with some more ideas. But you will also have been incubating. Whether you know it or not, your brain works in the background. It's another principle. Your brain is always working. It's doing a great job. And everybody's had the experience of going to sleep with a problem, waking up with a solution, or at least close to a solution. Well, that process of incubation is really, really powerful. So you come back and you look at the list and you will have a different perspective, probably a better perspective on the list itself. So it almost doesn't matter how long the list is. I'm being a little extreme. It almost doesn't matter how long the list is, as long as you feel that you've gone past, and here's the key, that you've gone past the obvious. Because we tend to list the things that are easiest, most familiar, most obvious first. Push yourself to the stuff that feels kind of uncomfortable because it's not so, obvious or conventional. And then once again, push yourself even further, because there's another principle that I should mention. It's called the principle of the third third. And it's one of the coolest of all. There's good psychological study that says that in a brainstorming session, the first third of ideas are those mundane, everybody's had them before ideas. Second third, those are a little bit, away from the norm, but they're still rooted in reality in a sense. The third third, that's those wacky ideas, those crazy ideas. And the odd thing is that sometimes the best solutions you will ever come up with, not always, of course, are in that third third. So when you feel, and it's a feel, I'm getting to those crazy ideas. Maybe I'm really tired. Maybe I'm just forcing myself and making, and there's tools that actually can facilitate forcing yourself to get into that space. That's the time to say, let's get a couple more of those third ideas, and then let's stop.
And then maybe take a break and come back to it tomorrow and see if they still sound crazy. Excellent. That's great. So one of the things I thought was really interesting was this idea that you can use these tools and this kind of thinking for any sort of decision making. And while we think there are differences between strategic thinking and creative thinking, or analytical and evaluative thinking, but you're saying that these tools apply sort of across the board to any kind of thinking. How does that work?
So here's a good example of that. And this applies particularly to people who, in the business that Microsoft is in, the software business. Earlier we talked about structure. So, algorithms and codes, what could be more highly structured than that? And we rely on data a lot. And we've almost made a god out of data. Well, data's great. It's fabulous. But the largest portion of our brains, by far the largest portion, and by far the fastest processing portion of our brains, is that thing that's called the subconscious, that emotional level of the brain.
The gut, right?
The so-called gut, right? So if you rely only on the logic part of your brain, it's kind of like counting on your fingers. Literally, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you can open the emotional portion of your brain, the feeling, the gut portion of your brain, it's like the most powerful supercomputer that you can possibly have. And this is not a metaphor. This is actually true. Your brain is calculating an astonishing number of things. We just generally don't have access to them, and so we have this name for it. We call it intuition, but it's not magic. It's not magic. It's actually there. So we have to give ourselves the opportunity to get to it. So let's come back to decision making. So how often has it happened where people have been in a room and they've made rigorous numerical decisions? What is the likelihood of this happening? What is the importance of the issue? And we add, we have this matrix and we add numbers and columns, rows and columns, and we come up with that, item number 1 scores a 92.6 and item number 7 scores an 89.4. And everybody kind of looks at that decision, they say, and then somewhere inside them, they say, you know what, but I think number 7's better.
So we get held up by that number, right? Like we get.
But everybody says, but 92, and you say, there's a reason that you're saying, I think number 7 is better. Now, again, nobody can predict the future. You don't know for sure. But I can guarantee you one thing, that the people who make the decision that they feel right about are going to be more committed to that solution than the people who don't. Right? So that's where this stuff comes in. It doesn't deny the value of data. Not at all. What it tries to do is enhance the value of data with a whole other portion of our brain that we know is there. Everybody knows it's there. There's no such thing as a sixth sense. That's that bucket that, just dump everything into the sixth sense. We know it's there. Why not try to access it in a meaningful, once again, structured way? And that's why the principles and tools that we're talking about can move way out of the realm of creativity and into powerful strategic decisions. Good financial decisions, really good financial decisions. Powerful decisions as it relates to your role in the community, in your social circle, in your family, and so on. Decisions about marketing programs, and on and on and on and on. I hate to quote or refer to, Steve Jobs. Everybody talks about Steve Jobs all the time. But, one of the things about Jobs is like he had gut. He had gut. And there's a lot of proof that he did a pretty good job with that.
So if you could give our partners homework to do, what homework would you give them?
It's a good question. I think one of the things to do would be to just do some small practice So we started out this interview with small stuff, with the power of a single list. Often what happens is that when you teach people new process or new structure, and particularly if they get excited about it, they try to apply it to the biggest, most humongous problem that they've ever had. They're not ready. It's like you weren't ready to run a marathon after you took your first step as a baby. You had to learn. You had to get used to it. So what I would suggest is take some of these simple principles that we've talked about, the principle of lists, the principle of structures, the principle of deferral of judgment, the principle of incubation, and there's some others that I haven't mentioned, but I should. It's the principle of stating things as questions as opposed to as statements. You know, statements are flat. They're lifeless. We don't have enough budget. Okay. How might we get more budget? Now your brain was activated instantly. So, principle of asking questions. And try them on little things. Try them on, I'm so dissatisfied with, the way I've organized my workspace. Let me see how I can, do a better job of that. Not big stuff. And see what works. Become habituated, in a sense, to approaching things in this way. Become habituated to not judging right away, just holding back just a little bit. Doesn't mean you don't judge. Write it down on the side, but don't verbalize it. Right? It's those small things that can add up. So the homework would be, it's kind of like, for those of you who do music, it's like scales. Great musicians practice their scales. Pablo Casals practiced his scales into his 90s. Here's the weird thing. Musicians never perform their scales, but they couldn't perform without them. Same thing. Little steps, get used to it, and you'll begin to feel and see the results of this new kind of thinking.
It seems like it's instituting a sort of deliberateness about the way you go about making decisions, rather than just assuming the right answer will come if you have the right kinds of discussions. But there's a very deliberateness about adding structure and doing lists and applying the principles.
In a sense, the homework is test it out. Test it out. But not on the biggest problem that you've ever had. Start small. And you will see. It happens with our clients all the time. They'll say, we've been wrestling with this problem for 2 years, and in less than 2 hours, we've made headway that we hadn't made, in the past. So it actually becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly. It is not hard to convert people once they try. It's not hard. It's actually pretty easy because
they see how it works.
It works. Yeah, exactly. It works. It's not a miracle. It's not a magic pill. It's not a silver bullet, but it works.
And I'm sure our partners will have questions and want to pursue more information. Where would be a good place for them to go for more information on your ideas?
Okay, a couple of things. The webpage is timhurson.com, TIMHURSON, one word, .com. There's descriptions of the 2 books that currently exist. That's Think Better and Never Be Closing. There is a 3rd book coming out, which is called, at the moment, it's not written yet, or at least finished. It's called How to Use Your Noodle. And it is literally a list. It's like a little recipe book, I guess, cookbook, of my favorite tools, the ones that I have noticed go way beyond that creativity and innovation space and can be used in virtually any context. And the way it's organized is, here are a bunch of contexts, the kinds of things that we often, encounter, and here are a bunch of tools that might work within that. Here's a bunch of different contexts and a bunch of other tools that might work with that. And of course, there's some overlaps, and that'll be coming out hopefully in the next 6 or 7 months. So those are good places to go. My email is tim@timhurson.com. I am really open. I like to share this material. People can write me. There's LinkedIn too.
Terrific. So are there any more principles that we should touch on before we conclude today?
Oh my goodness, there are. Let me just elaborate a little bit more on the principle of questions. And there's a simple way to maybe illustrate this. So if I were to say, here we are sitting in Toronto, and I happen to be going to Toledo, and I could say, it's far from Toronto to Toledo. And when you hear that sentence, you kind of take it in, you accept it, but not much is happening in your brain. But if I simply change that to a question, and I say, how far is it from Toledo to Toronto? Your brain gets activated. It could get activated in a lot of different ways. You might see, the Indiana Jones, plane flying across the globe. You might see time zones. But in some way, your brain has become more engaged just by putting the question mark at the end of that thing. So this idea of phrasing things as questions as opposed to statements is hugely powerful. We know MRI studies tell us that as well. But you can go further. And that is, you can ask what I call the right kind of questions. I do a lot of work with doctors. I do a lot of work with engineers, and I guess probably engineers are among the people who are listening to this. Doctors and engineers have a particular problem. Sorry, doctors and engineers. And that is that they hate to be wrong. They hate to be wrong. And there's good reason for that. You don't want your doctor to be wrong. And you probably don't want an engineer who is designing a big system to be wrong either. But because they hate to be wrong, they tend to ask questions that they already know the answers to. So where do you go when you have asked that kind of question? Exactly where you already are. The safe path is the one that takes you to where you've already been. So asking those tough questions, asking sometimes those scary questions is really important. So that's another principle. Ask the tough question. Ask the scary question. What's going to motivate you more? Going towards an ice cream sundae or running away from a lion. You're going to run away from the lion. And we know that when we phrase questions, if we say, let's talk about the opportunity involved in this thing. You do an MRI, a brain scan, like beep, 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 nothing. Say, let's talk about this weird problem that we're facing. MRI, bloop, 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 bloop. It's astonishing. So let's not fool ourselves. We talked way in the beginning of this talk about, walking through the jungle, the fight or flight principle. That flight principle is powerful. We want to survive. Why don't we tap into it instead of trying to escape it all the time?
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really valuable information. I'm sure our partners will appreciate having heard all this.
Check out the other podcast episodes in this series to learn more from Microsoft Partner Network thought leaders. Keep in touch with us via LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube by searching for the Microsoft Partner Network. And be sure to follow us on Twitter with the handle @MSPartner. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review it.